Kevin Costner, not simply a name carved into American cinema, but a gravity that forces an audience to slow down and listen. The quiet guardian of The Bodyguard, the lone dreamer in Field of Dreams, and the filmmaker who gave Dances with Wolves a living soul, compelling Hollywood to decelerate, to look inward, to choose truth over noise. From the red dust of Linwood, California, the son of a ditch digger and a quietly devoted social worker, he rose without privilege or shortcuts, driven by raw will, unbending belief, and an almost painful devotion to human stories. He doesn't perform emotion, he constructs it, carving meaning from silence, turning solitude into poetry, and building worlds where hope and fracture exist side by side. Behind the steady voice and composed gaze lies a heart worn thin by time and acclaim. 2 marriages undone, 7 children across 3 lives, trust fractured, courtrooms replacing kitchens, losses no spotlight could disguise. Applause never outlasted the silence after the curtain fell. Stage lights never warmed an empty home. Now, past 70, darkness no longer waits at a distance. It presses close, heavy, inescapable. If Kevin Costner has ever reached you through a role, a moment, or an unyielding spirit, press like as a quiet gesture of respect, a salute to one of the rare torches still burning in a Hollywood that glows brightly, yet so often feels cold. Some lives reach the world already bruised, carrying lessons learned long before applause ever arrives. Kevin Michael Costner was born on January 18, 1955, in the dust and sprawl of Linwood, California, the youngest son of William "Bill" Costner, a ditch digger who later climbed power lines for a living, and Sharon Ray, a social worker who brought other people's sorrow home in her eyes each night. Their days balanced on the thin edge between enough and not enough. Oil and metal clung to Bill's clothes. His boots tracked the earth straight through the door. His hands, thick and scarred, spoke fluently of labor without asking to be understood. Sharon returned each evening, tired yet attentive, humming softly over a stove that hissed more than it warmed, determined that gentleness would survive even when comfort did not. The house was small, the dreams unpolished, but love, quiet, steady, never performed, held the family together when winter pressed through walls too thin to keep anything else out. Years later, Kevin would look back and find that what shaped him most were not speeches or advice, but the steady image of his father fixing what failed and his mother carrying exhaustion with dignity, as if decency itself were a discipline learned one day at a time. Well before Hollywood learned to pronounce his name, the Costner household learned how loss can move in and refuse to leave. 2 years before Kevin was born, in 1953, tragedy settled into the family's bones. His middle brother, Mark Douglas Costner, lived for only a single day before a tiny heart went still. It was not the kind of grief that announces itself loudly, but the kind that rearranges a home in silence. After that, love became watchful, fierce, protective, sometimes sharp at the edges. Bill grew more rigid, guarding his remaining sons from a world he no longer trusted. Sharon grew quieter, tucking her tenderness into careful gestures and long pauses. Kevin would later remember moments that seemed suspended in time. His mother standing motionless in the kitchen, eyes resting on an empty corner as if a presence still lived there. His father answering that stillness with silence, rough hands gripping the table, holding the family together by force of will alone. No one explained what had been lost, yet everything revolved around it. In that hush, Kevin learned a lesson that would follow him for life. Pain does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it instructs by never raising its voice at all. Restlessness, not security, became his earliest teacher. By the age of 12, Kevin had folded his childhood into more cardboard boxes than many people ever will. Compton, Ventura, Visalia, Orange County, each move another farewell practiced too early, another beginning already aware of its ending. Looking back, he would say that home was something they were always sealing shut and reopening somewhere else, a rhythm that taught him to keep his thoughts guarded and close. Tape tearing across cardboard became the sound of growing up. He was not the loud one or the celebrated athlete, but the quiet boy teachers often overlooked, the child who filled margins with poems when answers were expected. He remembered one night as a moving truck pulled away, streetlights sliding past the car window like places borrowed and returned. He did not cry, only murmured goodbye to a town that never truly knew him. And yet, something endured. By his final years of high school, he had grown to 6'1", but the greater growth was internal. Church choirs where his voice shook with longing, late nights filling pages with skies and second chances, and a deep hunger for wide-open land that would not disappear overnight. His father's discipline became a compass, his mother's faith, a shelter. Starting over stopped feeling strange to me, he would later reflect, not as resignation, but as resolve. It was never simply about houses or addresses. It was about learning how to lose familiar ground repeatedly and still move forward, carrying hope with care, as if it were something fragile and worth protecting at all costs. At 23, newly married, nearly broke, and carrying a restlessness he could no longer silence, Kevin Costner stood at the edge of a life that looked sensible to everyone else and unbearable to himself. In 1978, fresh from California State University, Fullerton, with a degree in marketing and finance, he did what a devoted son was expected to do. He chose certainty. Each morning he buttoned his shirt, arrived on time, and learned the quiet discipline of disappearing behind a desk. The paycheck never failed. The days repeated themselves with mechanical precision. Yet somewhere between cubicles and the dull rhythm of typewriters, he felt his spirit compressing. Numbers paid the rent, but stories were where his breath lived in places no balance sheet could measure. Years later, he would remember that season, not as comfort, but as suffocation. How safety slowly stopped feeling like protection and began to resemble the careful erasure of the person he had not yet dared to become. Fate arrived without spectacle, occupying the empty seat beside him on a return flight from his honeymoon. The man to his right was Richard Burton, wearing a lifetime of roles as casually as a coat over his arm. With his pulse racing, Kevin admitted a truth he had buried for years, that he wanted to act, but fear had taught him how to stay still. Burton listened, unhurried, then smiled with the calm of someone who had survived ambition and said, "We share the same eyes. I think you'll be all right." When the plane touched down, the contrast cut cleanly. Burton stepped into a waiting limousine. Kevin and his wife joined the line for the bus. As the car rolled away, Burton leaned out and offered 2 quiet words. "Good luck," almost offhand. Yet those words split something open that would never seal again. Within weeks, Kevin resigned from his job. There was no applause, no reassurance, only a single suitcase, a second-hand jacket, and a battered Datsun aimed at Los Angeles with barely enough fuel to arrive in a city that did not yet know his name. What followed dismantled every illusion. Hunger, cold apartments, and a pride that refused to let him call home became his daily companions. He scrubbed boats until his hands cracked, drove delivery trucks through endless nights, guided bus tours past other people's dreams while quietly measuring the distance to his own. When the heat failed, he slept fully clothed, repeating a sentence that felt less like encouragement and more like command. "One more day. Keep moving." Salt and diesel clung to his skin. Exhaustion settled deep into his bones. Casting offices blurred into a single corridor of indifference. "Leave your photo," they said, eyes already elsewhere. He walked miles to save bus fare, learned the patience of waiting, and sat alone in his car on rainy nights outside studio gates, watching laughter spill into the light while he remained unseen in the dark. A classmate finally mentioned a tiny beach film. No pay, no promise, only work. Kevin arrived barefoot, sunburned, and ready. When the camera turned, something hardened inside him. Not optimism, but resolve. The film, Sizzle Beach, USA, later resurfaced as an embarrassment he wished could vanish, but humiliation was only half the wound. The deeper cut was erasure. For 6 long years, he auditioned into silence. Then came the big chill. He had a role. He showed up. He did the work. And when the lights dimmed at the premiere, he sat alone as the screen glowed, names rolling, applause rising, until the credits ended and his never appeared. For a moment, he wondered how long a man could stay invisible before forgetting the sound of his own name. He didn't leave early. He watched every second, then walked out into the night and went back to class. Nights were spent in acting rooms with folding chairs and harsh lights, learning how to turn rejection into craft and quiet into presence. "Dreams don't open doors," he would later say. "They teach you how to keep knocking." And when Lawrence Kasdan, the same director who had once cut him, called in 1985 with Silverado, Kevin Costner finally stepped into the frame. When the camera rolled, the man who had survived being unseen burned across the screen, not as a gift of chance, but as proof that endurance, practiced long enough, leaves marks no one can erase. What happens when the world finally looks at you and the weight of being seen presses harder than the years you spent invisible? From the moment Hollywood turned its head, the sound that reached Kevin Costner was not applause alone. It was pressure. He did not drift into the industry. He surged, like a man who had waited too long in the dark. The one who once drove trucks and scrubbed boats now stood at the center of screens, headlines, and expectation. When Silverado opened in 1985, his name no longer passed unnoticed. It lingered. There was something unmistakably human about him, less performance than presence, truth caught mid-breath. 2 years later, the Untouchables fixed his image as American resolve itself, a quiet, moral force, standing firm in chaos. The film crossed 100 million, but what it gave him weighed more than success: respect. With Bull Durham in 1988 and Field of Dreams the year after, he didn't just star in films, he entered memory. Standing in that cornfield, whispering, "If you build it, he will come," he felt the room lean toward him, not for spectacle, but for faith spoken without noise, the kind that reaches people who have waited a long time for something to answer back. By 35, creation stopped feeling like ambition and began to feel like necessity. In 1990, Costner risked his own money, formed TIG Productions, and committed to a 3-hour Western told partly in Lakota. Hollywood laughed. Executives urged him to cut the silences. He refused. "That quiet," he explained, "is where truth hides." What followed tested more than skill. Storms tore through sets. Actors walked away, budgets swelled, and nights stretched endlessly inside a freezing trailer where doubt circled like an animal that would not sleep. Years later, he would not remember those hours as courage, but as fear endured minute by minute. When Dances with Wolves finally reached the world, it did not merely succeed, it shifted what cinema could hold. $424 million, 7 Oscars, Best Picture, Best Director. The boy from Linwood was lifted into rare air. Yet, as the room thundered, he stood still. admitting quietly to himself, "I wasn't sure I could trust my own instincts." Applause filled the hall. Inside, the old hush returned, the same silence he had learned to live with long before anyone knew his name. Success carried him forward, but rest slipped away, and stillness became unfamiliar. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, soared to $390 million in 1991, even as critics mocked his accent. He smiled through it, though praise was beginning to tighten like a collar. That same year, he stepped into Oliver Stone's JFK, a storm of controversy that demanded conviction beyond performance. "Even questioning what might be true," he said, "is a kind of freedom." Then came The Bodyguard in 1992, waiting a year for Whitney Houston, turning down a $10 million salary for belief instead of certainty. The gamble exploded into history. $411 million at the box office, a soundtrack selling over 50 million copies, and more than $20 million to his name. By 1993, he earned $10 million per film, directing by day, editing by night, living inside motion. Friends worried he barely slept. "At some point," he admitted, "winning can feel heavier than losing." The strain surfaced when Waterworld nearly drowned him. Hurricanes destroying sets, budgets climbing to $235 million, his body tied to a mast as danger turned real, and headlines sharpened into mockery. The Postman followed, collapsing under ambition, sweeping the Razzies. Hands that once held Oscars now shook over unpaid bills. Still, he did not disappear. He returned to quieter stories, to westerns few dared touch, beginning again, as he always had. "Starting over never scared me," he said. Not bravado, just truth learned early. He was never chasing applause. He was chasing what felt honest. And honesty, forged under pressure, has a way of standing back up, scarred, slower, but unbroken. What remains when the clapping fades and you're left alone with your breath, your bones, and the quiet you once outran? The storms had passed, but they left Kevin Costner hollowed, like a house after furniture is carried out and the echo stays behind. He didn't need headlines to know he had fallen. He felt it in the phone that stopped ringing, in rooms once alive now emptied, in Hollywood's eyes learning how to look through him. For the first time in decades, there were no cameras waiting, no scripts pressing, only doubt humming, low and constant. "I wasn't shattered," he would later say, weighing the words. "I felt emptied, and emptiness asks harder questions." The papers mocked him as a relic, a vanity from another decade. He did not answer. "You don't chase every lie," he said once quietly. "You survive long enough for them to tire." Applause had once filled him. Now it only echoed. He could live without noise, but not without direction. And for a while, direction slipped away. Some nights his body hurt as sharply as his thoughts. Years of running hard settled into his bones. Still, he refused to lie still. Even in the quiet, something insisted there was more to say, whether anyone was listening or not. In Aspen, winter arrived early and stripped the world down to essentials. Snow softened the edges and sharpened the mind. The fire burned low. Silence weighed more than speech. He hiked alone, boots biting into drifts, asking not why the world had turned away, but why he had needed its approval so desperately. What surfaced wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. One morning, he watched the snow erase his own footprints and felt an unfamiliar calm take hold, as if the past had finally stopped following him. That winter, he wrote again, not to be seen, but to remember what honesty felt like in the hands. From that stillness came Open Range, 2003, a Western built on restraint rather than noise. It earned $68 million on a $26 million budget, But the truer return was quieter, his voice intact. Truth doesn't have to shout, he reflected. It survives by waiting. Success shows you how to rise. The long fall shows you who you are when no one is counting. When the silence broke again, it did not whisper. It rolled in like thunder. Yellowstone arrived in 2018, and at 63, Costner stepped into John Dutton, a man worn by duty, guarding what cannot be replaced. "I don't play heroes," he said. "I play men who keep trying." America recognized the honesty. The series became cable's most-watched drama, drawing 16 million viewers. By season 5, he earned $1.3 million per episode, not as spectacle, but as endurance made visible. Numbers never measured him. Purpose did. He rose before dawn, boots in dust, rewriting lines between takes. "You can't pretend what a man's eyes carry," he once told a young actor. And beyond the screen, an old promise stirred, one that refused to die. Horizon. An American saga had lived in him since 1988. Studios called it too long, too quiet, too costly. He went anyway, mortgaging his home, investing $38 million of his own. "If it misses," he said, steady, "it carries my name." In the Utah desert, wind cutting through his coat, exhaustion etched deep, he stood beside the camera as the sun bled into the horizon. "Keep rolling," he murmured. "We'll get there." He wasn't chasing perfection, he was keeping faith. When the first chapter premiered at Cannes in 2024, opinions split. He smiled. Approval had never been the point. The film earned less than he spent, $38.7 million, but the truest return was belief, tested and intact. That night, lights dimmed, he stood alone at the back of the theater as the final frame washed over his face. No triumph, just testament. At 70, Kevin Costner stands where few ever do, not at the peak but beyond it, having turned loss into legacy, work into devotion, and silence into something that finally sings. How cruel it is when love arrives like sunlight, warm, blinding, and full of promise, only to disappear without warning, leaving no wreckage, just cold. When Kevin Costner met Cindy Silva in 1975 at California State University, Fullerton, he was 20, unsure of himself, already half lost inside a future he could barely name. She was radiant, an actress in training, eyes open to possibility, believing easily. They met between classes, trading laughter for courage. She called him the quiet one, the boy who seemed to be listening for stories no one else could hear. In 1978, they married with little more than a borrowed ring and the reckless faith of youth, whispering that love would be enough. Their first home smelled of fresh paint and hope. Furniture rescued from sidewalks, nights warmed by cheap wine, and endless talk about someday. She worked double shifts. He drove through L.A., a traffic-chasing auditions that ended in silence, always coming home to her steady voice saying, "Don't stop." When Annie was born in 1984, Lily in 1986, and Joe in 1988, he wept each time, cradle in tiny fingers, promising to build a world worthy of them. For a while, he did. Picnics on borrowed weekends, lullabies whispered through exhaustion, family photos glowing under the California sun. "Cindy believed in me before the world ever did," he would later say, and that belief carried him through every fragile beginning. Then success began to consume the very ground it stood on, the untouchables, field of dreams, dances with wolves. Each triumph carved his name deeper into Hollywood stone, and with every standing ovation, another silence settled at home. Fame arrived like a flood. The man who once came home smelling of paint now returned carrying airports, hotel rooms, and studio lights in his clothes. Cindy waited through missed birthdays and holidays blurred by jet lag, raising 3 children in Ventura while reading about her husband in magazines. She never bought. On the night of the 1991 Oscars, as gold lights crowned him and applause shook the room, Cindy sat at home with 3 sleeping children, watching through a screen colder than glass. Trust doesn't collapse all at once, he would later reflect. It thins, slowly, like daylight slipping away. They tried to fight it. He paused projects. They sought counseling. They escaped to quiet cabins, hoping silence might teach them how to speak again. But distance had already learned the shape of the house. Rumors drifted. Nothing proven, yet everything corroded. The woman who once finished his sentences learned to choose words carefully to avoid breaking. The man who once promised forever began to realize he no longer knew how to come home. There are moments, he admitted, when winning feels lonelier than losing. Somewhere between airports and premieres forever ended, not with anger, but with exhaustion. In 1994, after 16 years, they ended what youth had sworn would never break. The negotiations were merciless. Cindy's attorneys reportedly saw close to $160 million, an arithmetic born of hurt, not greed, and after months of lawyers and silence, the settlement landed near $80 million, roughly $150 million in today's value. There had been no prenup, only trust. She kept the family, home, and custody of the children. He kept his company and the relentless forward pull of work. "You realize," he said once, his voice faltering, "you'll only see the people you love most half as much." The night the papers were signed, boxes were labeled family, movies, memories. They shared one last meal, no accusations, no raised voices, just fatigue. 2 hands reached for the same glass out of habit and stopped. They didn't argue. They just stopped. Outside, flashbulbs cracked like distant thunder. Inside, the quiet was complete. Hollywood called it one of the costliest divorces of its time. For them, it was the burial of a life built on hope. Cindy withdrew from view. Kevin drowned himself in work, convinced motion could numb what still hurt. Yet every premiere felt like penance. Fame could be rebuilt. The sound of 3 children under one roof could not. Years later, when the noise had thinned and his hair carried winter, he drove back to the old house in Ventura. The garden was gone, the paint weathered, but the wind still lifted the curtains the way it once had. He stood in the doorway where she used to wait, hearing the ghost of laughter and small feet in a hallway that no longer existed. For a moment, the man who had crossed the world met the boy he once was, hopeful, forgiven. "Home," he whispered, "isn't a place. It's the time you never get back." In that stillness lived every lesson earned without being taught. Love rarely ends in anger, but in absence. Applause fades faster than promises. The truest wealth is time spent, not money won. Kevin and Cindy chose kindness in the wreckage, co-parenting without bitterness, standing side by side at graduations, bound forever by faces that carried both their eyes. Their story remains the most human chapter of his legend, the sunlight and the storm, the rise and the ruin, and the quiet proof that even broken love can leave something sacred behind. What lingers after the noise recedes? When effort keeps moving but the heart learns to slow itself. 2 years after the storm, silence became a companion Kevin Costner never invited, yet slowly learned to live with. He worked without pause, sets, flights, smiles delivered on cue. But when the lights went dark, the only sound left was his own breathing, careful and alone. The man who once believed in forever moved differently now, measuring each step as if life might crack beneath him. Then, in 1996, gentleness arrived, without asking for anything. At a charity evening in Aspen amid falling snow and low laughter, he met Bridget Rooney, graceful, thoughtful, raised in privilege yet quietly kind. She asked him if he still believed in happiness. He paused longer than expected, searching himself before answering. "I still believe," he said, almost to himself. "I'm just not sure I've earned it." Some things leave their deepest marks precisely because they do not stay long. Their connection was quiet and sincere, two adults meeting not for distraction or headlines, but for understanding. She looked past the noise. He remembered what warmth felt like without urgency. From that short chapter came something permanent. A son, Liam Timothy Costner, born in 1996. When the news surfaced, the familiar hum followed, but Kevin met it plainly. There was a moment of uncertainty. A DNA test confirmed what both hearts already knew. He accepted responsibility immediately, without negotiation. A trust established, full support provided, a promise made that his child would never learn the pain of feeling invisible. "I won't let him grow up wondering if he matters," he told a friend, his voice steady but low. No boy should carry that question. This was not image management. It was conscience finding its shape. For the first time since his marriage had fallen apart, Kevin was building something with no audience, something meant for one life, not for the world to applaud. There was no spectacle when the ending arrived, only restraint. By 1998, the relationship reached its natural close, without bitterness or performance. Bridget later married businessman William Koch and spoke of Kevin with consistent respect, acknowledging the steadiness he brought as a father. Kevin kept his word in the quiet ways that never make headlines. Visits without cameras, gifts chosen carefully, milestones met without announcement. He never turned Liam into a story. He let him have a childhood. "I've made enough noise for 2 lifetimes," Kevin would later say, almost gently. "It's good he gets to live in quiet." That brief romance was not a scandal, but a small redemption, a lesson written softly after years written in capital letters. For Kevin Costner, Bridget Rooney was not another loss, but a reminder that love can arrive without promises. Ask little, and still leave behind something that lasts. In responsibility, he found a calmer grace. The storm had passed. What remained was light, not blinding, not loud, just enough to see the road ahead, and the man he was still learning to be. He believed the worst storms were behind him, that after decades of breaking and rebuilding, life had finally granted him permission to rest. When Kevin Costner met Christine Baumgartner, it wasn't the reckless ignition of youth, but the careful hope of a man who had already been burned and learned how to live with the scars. She was 20 years younger, composed and steady, a model and designer whose quiet confidence softened the restless urgency that had driven him for half a lifetime. They met in 1998, drifted apart in 2002 when she dreamed of children and he feared beginning again, then found their way back, slowly, deliberately, as if both understood how rare second chances were. "I couldn't lose her over that," he would later say, not as bravado, but as confession. Their wedding on September 25, 2004, at his Dunbar Ranch in Aspen, felt less like celebration than arrival. White tents glowed beneath mountain light, horses grazed beyond the vows, pine and promise filled the air. Christine arrived in a carriage, joy trembling in her hands. Kevin waited, eyes wet, leaning toward a friend and whispering, "I didn't think life would give me this again." For the first time in years, hope didn't feel borrowed or fragile. It felt earned, like something he was finally allowed to keep. For nearly 2 decades, they built something that looked like heaven. And for a while, it truly was. 3 children. Caden, 2007, Hayes, 2009, Grace, 2010, turned the ranch into a living fairy tale. Snow forts rose in Colorado winters. Bare feet raced along Santa Barbara sand in summer. Nights ended with popcorn, sleeping bags, and whispered stories told by the same voice that once commanded Hollywood sound stages. For once, he wasn't performing heroism. He was practicing it quietly every day. "This," he said once, almost in disbelief, "is what I was running toward." He took fewer roles, stayed longer at home, poured himself into Horizon as a legacy meant not for critics, but for his children to inherit. Applause faded. Laughter at the dinner table mattered more. It felt permanent. A second act no script could sabotage. But paradise doesn't always fall apart in flames. Sometimes it erodes. It thins slowly, unnoticed, until one morning the chair at the breakfast table stays empty and no one mentions it. Missed mornings became routine. Unreturned glances lingered a second too long. Bedroom doors closed more often than they opened. Yellowstone demanded months away. Horizon consumed time, savings, sleep. Work crept back into the spaces love once occupied. Christine began to feel invisible inside a life the world admired. She still set the table for 5, even on nights he didn't come home. She wanted presence. He offered provision. Neither meant harm. And yet love, starved quietly, thinned into silence, the kind that hums, not screams. In May 2023, that silence finally broke when she filed for divorce. Kevin was on set when the papers arrived, script still in his hands, eyes fixed on a signature that ended 19 years of belief. "It felt," he would later admit, choosing his words carefully, "like the ground slipped away beneath me." No drama, just truth. What followed was not private grief, but public unraveling. Headlines spoke in numbers. Requests for nearly $248,000 a month in child support, court rulings that reduced it to $63,000, prenuptial clauses enforced with legal precision, but none of them named the smallest loss of all: 3 children waking in different houses, waiting for the sound of a father's voice that now arrived through a phone. Under the prenup, Christine was ordered to leave the Santa Barbara home where first steps were taken, where laughter once echoed off tile and glass. Neighbors later said the day she left, the curtains fluttered as if the house itself were exhaling. Kevin came back that evening to rooms faint with her perfume and ocean air and learned something he had never known before: that silence has a scent. Days later, there was another cut. Photographs of Christine walking the coastline beside Josh Connor, a man Kevin had once trusted, shared dinners with, laughed alongside. Proof of nothing. Pain of everything. "I didn't want this," he told friends quietly. "I still love her. I just don't know how you unsee certain things." For the second time in his life, he divided a world he had built by hand. This time not measured in wealth, but in weekends, bedrooms, and the sound of his children's laughter split between homes. By early 2024, the marriage was legally over. The agreement held. The ache did not. He kept directing through the wreckage, building horizons for the screen while his own collapsed behind the camera. Late one night, alone in a trailer, he replayed a voice message from one of his children. Nothing dramatic, just a question about homework, followed by a soft, "Good night, Dad." He sat there longer than necessary, phone in his hand, listening to the silence after the message ended. And when the noise finally thinned, what remained were quieter frames. A kitchen light left burning with no one to turn it off. A suitcase rolling across a stone driveway as children watched from a window. A man choosing, again and again, to keep showing up. Kevin Costner will continue to co-parent, to attend school plays and birthdays, to keep his word in the quiet ways that never make headlines. Because love, when it is real, does not end with signatures. It becomes duty, then memory, then grace. And sometimes the deepest lesson is learned, not at the height of success, but in the moment a man realizes he cannot save the world he built. Only the children who still look to him for home. Perhaps the world remembers the day Whitney Houston slipped out of it. The banners tearing across screens, anchors pausing mid-sentence, the hush that spread faster than disbelief. She was 48, an age that still believes tomorrow will arrive on time. For the world, it was the silencing of a voice that once filled stadiums and lifted churches into something like grace. For Kevin Costner, it was something far quieter and infinitely heavier, the breaking of a promise never meant for public ears. They met in 1991 when fame had already shaped him into steadiness and crowned her untouchable. Yet beneath the polish, both carried the same unspoken truth. Perfection is a weight no one should carry alone. While The Bodyguard was still a fragile idea, Kevin noticed Whitney's hands tremble over the script. Executives hesitated. She had never acted. Some whispered that audiences might not accept her. Kevin didn't hesitate. "She's the one," he said, calm and immovable. "If she says yes, I'll wait." And he did. 1 full year. Not waiting for a superstar, but for a human being to feel safe enough to step into the light. When Whitney finally walked onto the set, shy beneath the glare, Kevin became what the story required long before the cameras turned. Her anchor. He guided her to marks, leaned in with jokes when nerves tightened, stayed close when rooms felt too large. She was frightened, he would later say carefully, and she was remarkable. Between takes, they talked about faith, about home, about how fame can feel like both shelter and storm. She called him my safe place. He called her the miracle I was trusted with. What the screen captured as chemistry was something rarer, trust, built quietly without witnesses. When the film premiered in 1992, the world leaned forward. The image of Kevin carrying Whitney through the rain became legend, but it was her voice, hesitant at first, then rising, that changed the room. "I will always love you" was more than a song. It was a vow held in air. For a few minutes, Kevin once reflected, she made people feel protected. Time, indifferent and exacting, moved on. The headlines surrounding Whitney darkened. The distance between the woman he knew and the woman the world consumed widened beyond reach. Kevin watched from afar, proud, helpless, understanding a truth he never tried to soften. Some battles cannot be fought for someone else. "People forget," he said quietly, "that behind every gift is a person trying to stay upright." Then came February 11th, 2012. A call, a pause, few words that rearranged everything. Whitney Houston was gone, alone in a Beverly Hills hotel room, hours before a night she had spoken of with hope. Plans unfinished. A return whispered, never reached. The world fractured. Candles lit outside churches, radios looping her songs until voices broke trying to follow her. Cities oceans apart stood still. Kevin did not. He sat in the quiet. "Are you certain?" was all he managed. Later he would say, "It felt like a light went out that I'd been walking toward for years." When asked to speak at her funeral in Newark, he wrote by lamplight, stopping often, letting memory interrupt his hand. On February 18, 2012, he stood before her casket, his voice carried to millions. He didn't perform grief. He allowed it. "Whitney," he began, soft and steady, "you weren't just good enough. You were great." He spoke of her fear of falling short, of how he had never shared that doubt. "The world wondered if you were ready," he said. "I never did." Then he paused, the room holding its breath. "And I will always love you." No music followed. Outside, Newark overflowed, some singing, some silent, all changed. Kevin went home and dimmed the lights. In the years after, he rarely spoke her name aloud. Friends noticed that when her song surfaced, he would gently turn the dial, not to erase her, but to keep the memory intact. When the film marked 3 decades, he finally said, "It worked because her heart was real." For the world, Whitney's passing marked the end of a voice that once made possibility feel close. For Kevin Costner, it marked the moment he learned that some promises exist not to be kept forever, but to define who we were brave enough to be when we made them. And somewhere between the notes she left behind, her voice still carries what he believed then, and never stopped believing now. Few people truly understand what it means to grow old inside a body that has never been allowed to rest. For Kevin Costner, time is not a number on a calendar, but a quiet adversary that lives in his joints, his spine, his breath. Each morning is no longer a beginning, it is a negotiation. The world remembers the hero, the sheriff, the cowboy, the man who never flinched. What it never saw was the figure limping off set after 12-hour days, fingers stiff as he wrapped his knees, forcing a smile before climbing back onto a horse. He didn't endure pain for pride. He endured it for honesty. Every triumph left a mark. Waterworld burned his skin and nearly took his life. Open Range ended with cracked ribs after a fall that knocked the wind and youth out of him. Hidden Figures brought kidney stones so severe he filmed under medication, refusing to miss a single day. "If there was anger in that scene," he once said softly, "it probably came from somewhere real." It always did. Every frame was bought with something taken from him. Today, at 70, the body remembers what the mind tries to outrun. Cold settles deep into his shoulders in Aspen. His back stiffens before dawn, protesting a life spent bracing against explosions and sun. Hands that once steadied others tremble slightly when mountain wind cuts across Dunbar Ranch. Doctors call it deterioration. He calls it evidence. Pain, he has said, choosing the word carefully, isn't my enemy. It reminds me I showed up. He moves slower now, but with purpose sharpened by scarcity. He wakes before sunrise, stepping into the Colorado chill as light spills across hills he has crossed for decades. He walks the same paths he once walked with his children, frost cracking beneath boots heavy with memory. Some mornings the effort is visible. Knees resist. The back argues. He pauses not to quit, but to breathe. Movement, he tells himself, almost like a rule, is how I stay alive. Then he moves again. What time has weakened in flesh, it has hardened in spirit. Even now, as horizon demands brutal days beneath unforgiving sun, he refuses comfort. Crew members say he works harder than men half his age, directing, acting, editing, while time hums relentlessly through his frame. Between takes he sits alone, eyes fixed on land, stretching toward a horizon he still believes in. "You can't fake what lives in a man's eyes," he once said, and his still shine, tired but unbroken. Youth, speed, invincibility, those are gone. What remains is rarer, the grace of knowing limits and choosing to cross them anyway. There are days the ache lingers longer than it should, when memories of past injuries surface like old ghosts. He doesn't complain. He folds the pain into the work and lets it speak for him. And for those watching from afar, older now, slower, waking stiff and tired, there is something sacred in witnessing him still rise, still ride, still believe. He has become a mirror for anyone who wakes up hurting and chooses movement over surrender. Late evenings in Aspen, when the sky burns gold, he stands by the fence, watching horses graze. Hands rest on the rail, veins sharp, lines deep. He breathes slowly, as if storing the light for harder days. Behind him, a life of storms. Ahead, another horizon waiting. He knows the body won't last. None do. But stories do. Faith does. Grit does. "I may have slowed," he once said, a faint smile breaking through fatigue. "But I haven't stopped." And that is his quiet masterpiece. Not the films, not the fame, but the refusal to yield. A man marked by time, not emptied by it. A body bearing witness, a spirit still riding. At 71, Kevin Costner moves through the world with a gravity that no balance sheet can explain. His estimated net worth, often placed between 250 and 300 million, was not born of a single golden era, but accumulated across 4 decades of acting, directing, producing, and crucially owning his work outright. While others chased relevance, he chose possession. While others borrowed momentum, he invested belief. Yet the meaning of that number has shifted over time. After marriages dissolved, settlements signed, and creative risks that demanded tens of millions of his own dollars placed back into unfinished visions, wealth stopped feeling like excess. It began to feel like proof that he had endured what many never see. Films like Horizon were never about trend or timing. They were about land, patience, and the quiet conviction that some stories are worth carrying even when the burden is heavy. Costner does not live as a man guarding victory. He lives as someone who knows how easily everything earned can be rearranged, thinned, or taken away. What defines him now is written most clearly in where he chooses to remain still. His real estate portfolio is expansive, yet stripped of spectacle. At its heart stands Dunbar Ranch in Aspen, Colorado, a working property that stretches across hundreds of acres, more ecosystem than estate. Multiple homes sit low against the land, built for weather and time rather than display. Horses move across open grazing ground, barns, stables, and long dirt paths cut through silence uninterrupted by traffic or cameras. There is no ornamental excess here, no glass walls demanding attention. Costner has long said that land tells the truth, and Dunbar does exactly that. It reflects durability, restraint, and respect. In California, his former Santa Barbara homes, including oceanfront property once valued in the tens of millions, were designed around family life rather than image. Wide kitchens, open living rooms, doors that led straight to the sea. Over the years, he sold, downsized, and simplified. These were never trophies. They were places where children learned to swim, where scripts were rewritten late at kitchen tables, where absence slowly settled into corners no renovation could erase. Even empty rooms remember. His approach to possessions follows the same quiet logic. Costner has never chased spectacle through machines. His garage has held custom Ford Raptors, classic American pickups, a well-kept Range Rover, and understated luxury SUVs. Vehicles chosen for terrain, weather, and function, each valued in the six-figure range, but built to work, not to pose. Friends describe garages filled with dust, gear, tools, and the evidence of use. His mornings arrive early. Stretching is careful now. The body that once absorbed storms, stunts, and endless takes carries the residue of decades spent insisting on physical truth. Chronic pain is managed daily through walking, light strength training, horseback riding, and a discipline rooted in listening rather than denial. Age has slowed his gait, curved his posture slightly, and etched deep lines into his face. What it has removed is pretense. He looks exactly like someone who has lived every mile he traveled and paid attention along the way. Inside, life has not grown easier. It has grown more precise. Costner is present for his children in ways that rarely make headlines. School plays instead of premieres, long phone calls instead of public statements, quiet weekends that never trend. He has children from different chapters of his life, different homes, different histories, and he treats that not as complication but as responsibility. Birthdays are non-negotiable. Graduations are sacred. When schedules collide, he bends his own first. Co-parenting is not something he theorizes about. It is something he practices repeatedly, imperfectly, and without applause. He speaks less about romance now, not from bitterness, but from earned caution, knowing how easily love can be stretched thin by distance, ambition, and time. Loss remains, marriages that ended, promises that could not be kept, years that no success can return. He carries those quietly, without rewriting the past to look better than it was. That interior narrowing shows up in his work. Yellowstone resonated not because of dominance, but because of fatigue, duty, and the weight of keeping others safe. Horizon goes further, choosing legacy over margin, patience over immediacy, something to hand down rather than something to cash in. Alongside it all, he has directed millions toward disaster relief, Native American communities, veterans, and environmental protection, often through land access and long-term commitment, rather than symbolic gestures. For him, impact is measured by how long it holds, not how loudly it announces itself. What Kevin Costner ultimately embodies is a form of influence that rarely trends, character that holds when admiration becomes heavy. Not charisma, not dominance, not perfection, but the ability to remain answerable to the people and principles that predate success. His life shows that real stature is not built by rising higher, but by refusing to shrink inward when life applies pressure. He did not become admirable because he avoided loss, pain, or fracture. He became admirable because he learned how to carry those fractures without letting them turn him into someone smaller, colder, or absent. In a world that celebrates escape, he chose containment. In moments where distance would have been easier, he practiced return. That is not romance. That is discipline of the soul. The quiet truth threaded through his story is this: influence is not what others feel about you, but what they are allowed to rely on you for. Costner's presence in his children's lives, his willingness to keep investing himself, time, money, body, belief, long after applause faded, reveals a specific kind of moral strength. Not the strength to conquer, but the strength to remain accountable when no one is scoring the outcome. His journey suggests that admiration extracts something in exchange, and the question is not whether you will pay, but whether you will pay with integrity or with absence. He chose integrity again and again, even when it cost comfort, speed, or certainty. If this story gave you pause, tap like, leave a heart in the comments, or share one responsibility in your own life that you are choosing to stay with instead of walking away from. Stories like this matter not because they inspire dreams, but because they remind us what kind of person we must become to deserve them.